My name's Jim Cheevers, for those of you, I know most of you, don't know me. I work at the Naval Academy Museum, and the assignment this afternoon is to give you a tour of the United States Naval Academy Cemetery. Well, we don't have a cemetery here at the Naval Academy that we know about, anyway, until July of 1869. In 1868, Vice Admiral David Dixon Porter, the sixth superintendent of the Academy, purchased two big parcels of land on this side of what was then Dorsey Creek. This creek has had many names. Roberts Creek was the earliest one that we know of. Graveyard Creek, because there's several other graveyards above us here on this creek. And also Dorsey Creek, and most recently College Creek, because of St. John's and the Naval Academy located on its shores. But anyway, Porter bought from Charles Reese and his wife two big farms, one called Prospect Hill, which was over on the King George Street side and included where the Green Water Tower is today, and then a farm located here along the shore of the Severn River called Strawberry Hill. In 1780, a local fellow named Thomas Spriggs built a big house up on the top of Strawberry Hill, up where this hospital is today. And that became his home. He was also a friend of a guy named George Washington. I often ask the plebes what president slept in Annapolis the most. And none of them remember Jimmy Carter, who slept here for 3 years as a midshipman. But George Washington was definitely number two. We know he made at least 17 visits to Annapolis in his lifetime. And several of those visits he spent on what are now the grounds of the Naval Academy, a house over at the bottom of Maryland Avenue, and then the Governor's Mansion, which was over where Dahlgren Hall is today, were places where he frequently stayed, particularly in September, for the horse races. He was quite a betting man. But he also went to the theater while he was here and dined with Mr. Spriggs. In 1796, Mr. Spriggs leased his house up here on the hill to an emigre from Belgium named Henri Stier, who had also had a pretty daughter, Rosalie Stier. They didn't stay too long on Strawberry Hill. It was probably too damp for them, and they moved into town into what we know today as the Paca House. And it was at the Paca House on Prince George Street that Rosalie fell in love with George Calvert, the 5th Lord Baltimore, who was living around the corner on State Circle. And they eventually moved into a house her father started in Prince George's County called Riversdale. It's one of the fine historic 5-part house here in Maryland, and it's open to the public. George and Rosalie's son established a Maryland Agricultural School in what we know today as College Park, Maryland, the University of Maryland. They did a lot of agricultural experiments at their farm in PG County. So the two big farms, as I say, Porter purchased. We know one, after Spriggs died, the house up on the hill here became the poorhouse for Anne Arundel County, which it was used until 1823, when that operation moved to London Town. And London Town was still being operated as a poorhouse when I came to Annapolis in 1967. Of course, today, again, it's a historic house and a wonderful place to visit, and a very important place in the colonial period on the South River, bringing people across to Annapolis Neck. But we don't know who actually lived in the house after it was a poorhouse up until the period of the Civil War. And the McCubbin family moved in. They were a local family that had real estate out towards the Bay Bridge also. And we know about that family because there was a officer teaching at the Naval Academy when the Civil War broke out named John Tyler Wood. And Wood and his brother, Wood graduated from the Naval Academy in 1853, and his brother graduated from West Point the same year and was an officer in the Army. And when the Civil War broke out, his brother, the Army officer, and they had farms over where our football stadium is today. And when the Civil War broke out, the Army officer immediately resigned and went south. Wood was trying to figure out what to do with himself, and then supposedly one night some New York Regiment, 7th Regiment soldiers snuck across the creek here and stole some chickens from the Cubbins, and that was what sent Wood south. And of course, there's a legend that he buried his silver, family silver, over in the area of Admiral Heights. I don't know whether that's true or not, but anyway, the reason those guys were Southern sympathizers was that their dad had married a daughter of General Zachary Taylor. And of course, another daughter of Zachary Taylor married a guy named Jefferson Davis. So their aunt and uncle were the President and First Lady of the Confederate States of America. John Taylor Wood did a great job for the Confederacy during the Civil War in their Navy. Anyway, let's go ahead and start up the hill. Here on our left, we call the silver pimple on the hill the current U.S. Naval Academy Observatory, and I'll never forget the day back, I think it was 1981, midshipman came to my office in the basement of the museum all excited. His class had come the day before been on a tour of the Naval Observatory in Washington, and they had been shown a telescope that had been used here at the Naval Academy in the observatory built in the 1850s. And it was still in good shape. So they were looking for some way to bring that telescope back to Annapolis. And of course, the folks that ran the observatory were very anxious to get rid of it. So I called Mark Tuzo, who was Director of Development at the time at the U.S. Naval Academy Alumni Association. And Mark immediately grabbed the class of 1941. And they underwrote the construction of our current observatory. Well, I moved too far, but of course the Marine Barracks, the old Marine Barracks, Halligan Hall, is over in that direction too, and it became the Naval Academy Postgraduate School officially in 1919, but it was being used for graduate courses before that because the Marines were always being pulled out and sent down to police actions in the Caribbean, and also, of course, World War I. Actually, midshipmen lived in Halligan during World War I too, because the regiment of midshipmen grew 300% during World War I, and we eventually built 5th and 6th wings of Bancroft. Also, under Admiral David Dixon Porter, he caused this cemetery to be laid out in the summer of 1869, and also 3 miles of walking and hiking trails. And in another letter, he said he was expanding it another couple of miles, and they were covered with oyster shells. And then he also had built where the Green Water Tower is over there in the distance, a huge naval hospital. And it became known as Porter's Folly. I just put a picture of it on exhibition up on the 2nd deck of the museum, and you should stop by and see it. It was an amazing building. But it was so large, they could have never afford to operate it. It was operated for a few months after it was finished as a hospital. The midshipmen were complaining bitterly about having to ride the rough road in a wagon over to the new hospital from their dormitory that sat where Leahy Hall is today. And so that hospital was closed up and used for storage the rest of its life. And it was in existence up into the 20th century. There are pictures of Halligan Hall in the foreground with the old Porter's Folly Hospital in the background. It would have been a great hotel. Now, if you study the history of naval cemeteries, they were mostly the result of naval hospitals. The British first built a hospital at Gosport in England, and within months, of course, they added a cemetery nearby. What's amazing about our cemetery here is that it was here first, and then they built a hospital near it. And although we had hospitals here since 1845, the Congress voted in 1811 to permit the Navy to construct hospitals. It took a few years before they actually added a hospital up at Brooklyn, New York Navy Yard in 1824, another one at Boston about 1830. Our first hospital was located over where Bancroft Hall is today. It was a very small, modest building. Then in 1857, we built a second one, which is on the site of where the Naval Academy Club is now. It was right next to the new barracks, the new dormitory that Porter caused to be built in the 1860s, called New Quarters or Cadet Quarters. So it was very convenient, and I loved the building. It had open porches all around it, so they really believed in fresh air as a curative back in those days. And then I've talked about Porter's Folly. Well, when the new Naval Academy was built at the turn of the 20th century, between 1899 and 1908, the entire academy is torn down and rebuilt. They added a new hospital over here on the hill. It was a separate contract, but it was the same architect, Ernest Flagg, 1857 to 1947, who studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. So we call his architecture Beaux-Arts architecture. And you can see up in the center with the cupola, that's the original buildings. It was added on to over the years. The most recent addition is the one closest to us here, now called Beach Hall, the headquarters of the Naval Institute and Naval Academy Alumni Association Foundation down in the morgue area in the basement. That was added in 1958. In fact, I had lunch today with a sister who had her first baby in that building, and she was asking me about it. Anyway, as I said, this cemetery was laid out in 1869, and when you study it and walk around it, you can see in a number of periods there were certain ranks that were buried in certain sections. Certain classmates, of course, that wanted to be near one another. There's some fascinating stories like that about the development of this cemetery. And in the 1980s, we had only about 600 grave sites in the ground left. So new policies were developed on the cemetery so that now only flag officers or midshipmen who die here at the Academy are buried in the ground in the cemetery. And the Alumni Association raised funds for the columbarium, which is down here over the hill, that has 2,400 niches, so it can hold nearly 5,000 bodies. And there have already been long discussions about expanding the columbarium, I know. Well, we'll go ahead and move through. And in the recent years, there have been more midshipmen buried in here than ever before. For many years, and in fact, of course, in the early history of the Academy, there were only four deaths here between 1845 and 1860, and I'm sure that all four of those bodies were sent home for burial. But Kristen Dickman, I know we have her cover, her hat. I don't know whether Tracy used it in the show. You didn't. But anyway, it was used on the Herndon Monument the year she died as a plebe. There have been 61 superintendents of the Naval Academy, and 27 of them are buried here at the Naval Academy, and there's another one that has reservations here. This is the gravestone of Admiral Harry H. Hill, who was the superintendent here in the early 1950s. And the story everybody likes to tell about Admiral Hill, he was the supe when the class of '52 did their color parade on Warden Field, and at the end of the parade they had all loosened their shoes and left the entire first class shoes on the parade field. Admiral Hill was not amused at the time. And there have been years since when midshipmen who have heard of that story, although I can remember a meeting in the soup's office a few years ago about commissioning week, and the soup turned to Captain Peg Klein and said, "I don't want to see a shoe on that field." And I don't know how she did it. I think she went through Bancroft putting crazy glue in all the shoes, but there wasn't a shoe that week on the field. Also, I think it's fascinating, standing on this site, you can look down and see the Hill Bridge. the bridge here that crosses College Creek is named for this admiral. And on the other side of the cemetery, on the side of the hill, is the grave of another superintendent, Aubrey Fitch, who was started his superintendency the day World War II ended. And his grave overlooks the footbridge, which is named for him. There are 10 Medal of Honor winners interred here in the Naval Academy Cemetery, and one of the most prominent is right here in front of us. Admiral Stockdale was our senior POW in Vietnam. Next to him, there's only one chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff here, and that's Admiral Crown. He's right next to Stockdale. And there are currently 4 former chiefs of naval operations in the cemetery, and there's one that has reservations. In fact, his stone is in here with his name on it, but he hasn't died yet. That's an interesting custom here. Also, in the distance over here, you see a stone with the name Fuller on it, and I'm surprised there isn't a bouquet of flowers on it today, because today is the 241st birthday of the United States Marine Corps. Yes?
The wreath is on the other side.
Oh, it's on the other side. Oh, hi. Anyway, every birthday of the Marine Corps, the 10th of November, the Marines come in here and put a wreath. He's the only commandant of the Corps in the cemetery. Then the cross, the biggest cross here in front of us, is that of Charles A. Zimmerman. Charles A. Zimmerman was the bandmaster of the United States Naval Academy Band from the 1880s to his death in 1916. And of course, he had the nice custom of composing a new piece of music for each graduating class. His most famous composition was for the class of 1907, Anchors Aweigh. And up on top of the hill, we'll see, I'll point out the grave of the midshipman who wrote the words. Zimmerman composed the music. Zimmerman had one of the largest funerals on record in Annapolis when he died in 1916. His service was conducted at St. Mary's Church on Duke of Gloucester, and he was originally buried in their cemetery, and then a few months later, Ida, his surviving widow, authorized them to dig him up and bring him over and put him in the Naval Academy Cemetery. The lone grave down here in the lawn is Ned Beach, class of 39, who the hall is named for. Actually, the hall today is named for he and his father, also an Edward Beach, both of whom were very frequent writers for the Naval Institute Proceedings magazines. Ned was I had the honor and privilege of knowing Ned. He was a great guy and a great interest in naval history. He wrote a wonderful one-volume book, but also a good author overall. And this is the newer section down towards the road on the left. Since I have some fellow staff members here from the museum, here's the grave of Harry A. Baldrige, who was the director of the Naval Academy Museum in the 1930s, and during the construction of Preble Hall. Admiral Shapiro here, former head of Naval Intelligence, was one of the first black marble stones in the cemetery, and that's become rather popular. We'll see on the other side the stone of Admiral Arleigh Burke, our longest serving Chief of Naval Operations, and his is also a polished black stone, as is Admiral Zumwalt, another Chief of Naval Operations over there. Down over the hill here is one of the most fascinating graves when I first started researching this cemetery. And it's the grave of Commodore Theodoric Porter, who was a son of Admiral David Dixon Porter. He was a midshipman when his father was superintendent here. And he married Betty Mason. And Betty's father, Judge Mason, owned Ogle Hall. Today we know it better as the Naval Academy Alumni House. And Betty inherited that house, and she and Theodoric lived there. Of course, he had a lot of duty away from Annapolis. She died before he did, and he married again. And then when it came, his daughter, Mrs. Cusack, lived with them. And when the second Mrs. Porter died, she didn't want her interred here in the Naval Academy Cemetery. The correspondence in the archives is hilarious. Back and forth with the superintendent refusing to dig up the first Mrs. because the first Mrs. Porter was buried in the wrong site on the grave, and it's quite interesting. It wasn't the first time that they thought of digging the cemetery up and moving it, though. In 1899, when they started talking about a new hospital, the hospital that's over here with us, they were going to put the hospital on the most prominent point of land, and they were going to move all the cemetery, but they didn't. Right behind Zumwalt's stone here is another black stone with the name Lovell on it. That's another couple that have reservations here. When they came back for their 50th reunion, he was class of 52, astronaut Captain James Lovell. Stopped by my office. He used to call me every time before he went into space. He was given a little prayer book when he was a midshipman when he graduated, and every flight he took, he borrowed that back from the museum, including Apollo 13, and took that with it, and it's on exhibit in the museum today. But he and Marilyn have reservations here in the cemetery. I had the good fortune one time of coming through the cemetery with a local friend who brought a friend with her who was really into gravestones and the design of them. And it's amazing how many different designs there are here in our cemetery. Austin M. Knight, one of intellectual naval officers who wrote the seamanship book that was used here as a textbook for many years. Vice Admiral William Mack, our superintendent in the 1970s, his wife Ruth. This row of stones here includes Admiral Foxhall A. Parker. Parker is the only superintendent to ever die on the job. His first June week or graduation week here, a couple of days after graduation, Admiral Parker dropped dead. He's a fascinating guy. His father, the same name, Foxhall A. Parker, was an early senior officer in the 19th century Navy. And he has another son named William H. Parker, who also attended the U.S. Naval Academy. When the Civil War came along, William resigned and went south, and he becomes the superintendent of the Confederate State Naval Academy, which was primarily aboard the CSS Patrick Henry in the James River. But those midshipmen also saw combat duty at Drury Hill and so forth in campaigns along the James, and then escorted the Confederate treasury all the way south to Georgia at the end of the war before they resigned and closed the Confederate Naval Academy. William, after the war, swears his allegiance again to the United States, and he follows Franklin Buchanan, our first superintendent, who after the war also went south, and then after the war came back to Maryland and became the president of the University of Maryland at College Park. And William H. Parker followed him as the president of College Park of the University of Maryland. The interesting round stone with the wreath on it belongs to a fellow named Moreau, who died in 1866. There are 10 stones here in the Naval Academy Cemetery for folks that died before 1869, before we had a cemetery. And I've spent a lot of time working on those people. This fellow's sister had this stone erected. We doubt, although someday we should get an investigative team in here, that he's buried there. He died aboard the USS Florida and was probably buried at sea. But his sister had this beautiful stone erected to him. And then just recently, we discovered some letters in our collection between Admiral David Dixon Porter and a guy named Norman Farquhar, who was class of 1859. He came back on 3 tours here, including one as Commandant and Midshipman. But on his first tour here with his new wife and the right after the Civil War, they lost a child who was only 7 months old. And that child was buried on the grounds of the Naval Academy. And this is how I just recently learned that there was burials here in the yard before this cemetery was created. And we don't know where. Most of them were anyway. But that kid was moved over here by Admiral Porter, and he writes a beautiful letter to then Lieutenant Farquhar explaining how he had great respect for this child and for them, and had him reinterred over here in the cemetery. And there's a beautiful stone on the site. Then a couple of years ago, somebody sent me a clipping from the Washington Post. In 1902, when they broke ground for Bancroft Hall, they found 12 coffins. And in one of those coffins, when they examined it, was a coin dated 1816. So we figured that those 12 burials were for Fort Severn, the Army post that was located here from 1808 to 1845. And I know of one grave over in St. Anne's Cemetery up the creek here of a Major Andrew Taylor, who died at Fort Severn in March of 1845. And he's buried over in St. Anne's Cemetery. But I found none others, and no Naval Academy graduates over there that at least, Waddell is over there. Now,
what did
here.
they do with the 12 coffins they found over there?
I don't know what they did with them. All I know is the newspaper article. Yeah, the records the early records on this cemetery are horrible. I mean, there is a ledger, a handwritten ledger, I think made in the 1870s, but we don't know. I don't think there are many dates on it. And it's just a list of names of people buried over here, and no real good records. And then I'll tell you, when I started doing research on this place, at that time, Grace Registration was located in the security office. And I had come over here after work and weekends looking around, and I couldn't find the grave of the most senior officer buried here in the cemetery, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King, World War CNO throughout World War II. And, well, I called over there, and she said, "Oh, I think it's grown over with vicious and vines." So I came over here that night after work, and luckily I didn't get poison ivy. And then the last day before, I said, "You know, I'm doing this tour for the Women's Club, and they tell me that Soup's wife and the Commandant's wife are going to be, I better, you know." And she said, "The groundskeeper going to come over the hill in his pickup truck and tell you where King's grave is." So I'm leading the ladies up the hill, and this pickup truck indeed came by. He rolls down his window and he shrugs his shoulders. It was so funny. But we'll see Admiral King's stone. Where it was, his son was dying over in Easton on the eastern shore, so the family had the big stone removed, thinking they were going to put Joe Jr.'s name on it, and they didn't. In the end, they put a separate stone. I couldn't believe security didn't know that tombstone had left the cemetery. Now here at the Naval Academy, we have another number of monuments to dead people in which no one is buried under. The largest monument in this cemetery is the Jeanette Monument here, which was designed by the head of the drawing department, a guy named George Culver Cressy, a native of Vermont, who later retired as an admiral in our Navy. He was also a commandant of midshipmen. But in 1890, he was head of the drawing department, and his fellow naval officers had raised money for a monument to the victims of the Jeanette Arctic expedition, 1879 to 81. And so this is that monument. They did recover the bodies up in Siberia and brought them back to America, but they're all buried up in New York. Now over in the yard, the oldest monument to the dead is the Mexican War Monument. There are 4 midshipmen on that that died during the Mexican War. Then of course the Herndon Monument, that's for one guy, died and went down with a ship off Savannah in a hurricane in 1857, William Lewis Herndon. And then and that was erected in June of 1860, and then in November 1860 the Tripoli Monument was moved over from Washington and erected not far from where it is today, and that honors 5 naval officers who died in the Barbary War against Tripoli in 1804. Then we have this one, and then of course we have several other monuments in here that there's probably nobody underneath. over to our left here somewhere is a stone that says Ballard on it. Commodore Henry Ballard, one of at least 3 people born in the 18th century buried here in the cemetery. And he and his wife died near Annapolis in 1855. I think they were buried on the family plantation originally out towards the Bay Bridge, and then later moved in here. Over here is the grave of Bancroft Gaharty. That is a nephew of George Bancroft, the Secretary of the Navy that founded the Naval Academy. And then over here also is Miles, class of 1907, who wrote the words to the first 2 verses of Anchors Aweigh. Behind the stone, the big monument, are graves of superintendents like William P. Lawrence and Jim Calvert and Richard Naughton. Over here, the stone with the round cannonball on top of it is the grave of James Booth Lockwood. He's a West Point graduate. And there are several West Point graduates buried here in the Naval Academy Cemetery. But this one is the son of Henry Hayes Lockwood, who was one of the first 7 faculty members of the U.S. Naval Academy. And James Booth Lockwood died in an Arctic expedition also. And in fact, we wonder how much of him is in there because they were doing cannibalism on that expedition up in Greenland. His folks are behind him, the tomb of Henry Hayes Lockwood. And this section here was the original section for faculty members. You'll find a lot of old faculty members in this section. One way they show in a tombstone how a person died young before their time is the clip column. And this is a guy named Terry, who was also a former commandant, a midshipman here. Folks in the circle are all from the Pringle family. And this obelisk was placed here by Mrs. Isaac Mayo about 1870. Again, we don't know whether Isaac Mayo himself is under this stone. And we'd love to check that out someday. The records, again, are so poor. But he was a native of Anne Arundel County, Maryland. His home, Gresham, still stands down in the town of Mayo that's named for him on the South River. A guy named Johnson, a swimming pool contractor, owns the house today. And he had a long and distinguished service. He and Ballard, who's over there, are 2 people born in the 18th century that are buried in this graveyard. They also both got medals in the War of 1812 for being in very important battles. In May of April 1861, Isaac Mayo thinks that his state of Maryland, his home state, is going to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. So he submits a letter of resignation to Secretary Gideon Welles. And then he learns that Maryland isn't going to secede, and he tries to pull that letter, and they didn't anyway successfully pull it before he dies. In fact, some folks think he may have committed suicide over the whole event. But his death was recorded in St. James Parish in South County. Those records are now in the state archives, but there's no record of where he was buried. The family had a vault up here in St. Anne Cemetery. I've crawled all over it with the black widow spiders and never found mention of Commodore Isaac Mayo. So we don't know exactly, and his biographer, a guy graduated from here in 1950, still is uncertain too about where Isaac Mayo. He was also on the Board of Examiners in 1845 that Bancroft asked to advise him on a plan for the new Naval Academy, or the new Naval School at Annapolis. And of course, he's probably the influential one that caused the school to be located here in Annapolis, because he was very familiar with Fort Severn, whereas A.P. Catesby Jones, who was a native of Maryland and on the same board, thought it should be located on Craney Island down in Norfolk. Admiral Davidson, another Supe. Admiral Holloway, a Supe, and also a future, I think, Chief of Naval Operations, but he's still with us. He's not dead yet. Reeves, also credited with developing one of the first football helmets, a leather helmet. Admiral Reeves, and also trained the Navy between the two world wars, particularly in amphibious pursuits. And Hayworth, also a commandant and a soup. Admiral Trost, another superintendent. Peary, another commandant of midshipmen. And then there are three graves here that are absolutely fascinating. This one here, Flusier, class of 1853, a native Annapolitan who went to the Naval Academy. And a guy named Preston, similar stone down here. Both these folks were friends of the guy in the real fancy one on the point. That's William Cushing, William Barker Cushing's grave. Cushing washed out of here. He was class of 1861, and in the spring of 61, he resigned from the academy. He went into Washington, and before the Civil War broke out, he was still around, and when the war broke out, he was still around. And his friend Flusier, who had also been one of his teachers here at the Naval Academy, got him a commission as a volunteer master in the United States Navy. He served throughout the war, and by the end of the war, Secretary Gideon Welles referred to him as the naval hero of the Civil War. And you didn't want to stand next to this guy in battle. That's what happened to Preston in the Battle of Fort Fisher. He was killed. Flusier actually died aboard the Miami in North Carolina, and Cushing revenged his death by sinking the CSS Albemarle, which is named on the side of his tombstone over there. Confederate ironclad at Plymouth, North Carolina, under the cover of darkness with a picket boat, snuck in with a spar torpedo. That's an explosive device on the end of a stick, and it was just amazing. They had to jump some logs to get it into the Albemarle, but they did, and then they backed off, realized that they were probably going to be captured, so they all jumped overboard. And Cushing got away, but most of them did get captured. And Cushing got away and survived to fight another day, including Fort Fisher. He dies in St. Elizabeth's Hospital for the Insane in 1874. He had some kind of a medical condition in his back, and he was in such pain. They were giving him medications that, of course, blew his mind. And his wife and mother were with him. Actually, his mother outlived her 4 sons, including him and another son who died of disease, one who was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg, and then 2 years ago, President Barack Obama presented that brother a Medal of Honor. And another one died against the Native Americans out on the frontier. But Flusier, and I'm sure that Cushing somehow made the arrangements to have Flusier and Preston moved here to be with him in eternity. I'll never forget the day that Les Palmer came to the museum basement. It was raining that day. He had a raincoat. I didn't know who he was, but I noticed he had a Captain Eagles on his shoulders. And as he was talking, he opened his coat, and I saw his name tag. I said, "Oh my God, that's the new Commandant of Midshipmen." And he was asking if we still had the print of the brig Somers with Midshipman Philip Spencer hanging from the yardarm for mutiny. And we said, "Yes, sir, but it's in a road show on Courier and Ives Navy right now." He said, "Well, when it comes back, I want it for my office." And I thought, oh boy, those midshipmen are in trouble this time. But Les, unfortunately, died, dropped dead, jogging over here on Christmas Eve in 1984. Admiral Kirkpatrick, another superintendent in the early 60s. Russell Wilson, a superintendent. And over in the background, you can see the Kidd Stone. Now, there's one kid that's not buried there, but his name is on the stone, and that's Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, who is still aboard the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. He was the senior naval officer killed that day. And right here in the foreground, you see the stone of Theodore Gordon Eliason. He is Naval Aviator number 1. the one with the Celtic cross, and it says Blandon at the base of it. That fellow was aboard the USS Maine when it blew up in Havana Harbor on the night of February 15th, 1898. But he survived. And when the Naval Institute did a discussion in 1998 on the loss of the Maine and over in Alumni Hall, I was staged up in the front row. Bob Woodward was the moderator, and at the end they had this big discussion about what way metal bends depending on where the explosion is located. Admiral Rickover, of course, thought that the Maine sank from an internal explosion by studying the patterns on the metal and so forth. This fellow wrote a letter home to his wife the next morning, and I was staged in the front row. It had been donated to the museum a few weeks earlier, and Woodward say, "Are there any more comments?" And I waved the letter and I read it to them, and he says, tells her that has survived, and he says, "P.S. I don't think the Spanish had anything to do with it. P.P.S. Don't ever tell anybody." I said that. You're all familiar with the figurehead of the Delaware over in front of T Court in front of Bancroft Hall. I think, God, my eyes are not good. Yeah, Pete Asserson. He's the guy responsible for that figurehead being brought here. He's not a graduate of the Academy, but his son graduated from here. But he certainly caused a very important monument. Now, over here to our left, this section down here originally was the enlisted section. And we'll see the two earliest enlisted guys who died here, or died nearby anyway. But in the spring of 1878, they dug up a bunch of bodies on the beach of North Carolina and brought them here. And the previous year, the USS Huron had sailed out of Norfolk and ran into the graveyard of the Atlantic, a fierce storm off Cape Hatteras, and sank. The victims were all buried in the beach. We still are in a quandary of why they were buried here, except that this was a fairly new cemetery and had plenty of space at the time, because the officers of that ship that died were all sent home. They weren't buried here, but a good number of the enlisted graves. Also over in this section, you'll see some stones with lambs on them and children's identifications. And in the 1950s, we lost a lot of children up in the hospital. And for years, I thought it was polio. I grew up in the 50s, and polio was a big epidemic at that time. And then one day, I got a call from a retired naval surgeon up in Newport. And he said, "Jim, would you be interested in the Book of the Dead?" And I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a record of everybody that died in the hospital. And when we were closing that hospital in 1974, they threw it in the trash. So I rescued it and brought it home, and I said, boy, would I love to see that." And he sent it. I went through, and it turned out that all these children that died back then was all premature birth. And of course, that's still a major problem in the United States. We in the civilized world, we don't have a very good record for premature birth here. And of course, that book today is with Jennifer. Oh yeah, there's right there. It's over in the Naval Academy archives. The Elgers here, great professor here at the Naval Academy, and Louisa Elger, also related to the Rogers family of Maryland. And I used to love a guy named Roy Smith, class of 34, used to come by with full of stories all the time. And that was his grandmother. And we have a stone over here with an anchor and a chain on top. And there are two midshipmen buried there who died in a turret explosion. And it turns out one of them was fiancé of the other's sister. They were engaged to be married, but they were both died in that. And back there, I think, is the tomb of Admiral Charles Larson. Served 2 terms here as superintendent. But if anybody ever finds out where the other superintendent that served 2 terms as superintendent here, I'd love to know where he's buried. George Blake. He actually outdoes Larson by a few days as being the longest serving superintendent, but they both had 2 tours here, as did Christopher Raymond Perry Rogers, who I forgot to point out up on the top of the hill. We had 2 soups, Rogers and Larson, that had 2 tours, but Blake was superintendent when the Civil War broke out, so he remained and has the longest term as a soup. Now, coming up here on the left, it's interesting. There are 2 of the oldest stones in the cemetery back. Yeah, here's Whippard and Taylor. These are the 2 fellows that died aboard the USS Preble in 1852. And directly across from them is Admiral Arleigh Burke, class of 1923, and the longest serving Chief of Naval Operations. And Burke was originally from Boulder, Colorado, and he always considered himself a sailor, and you can see he has that under his name, and under Bobby's name, his wife, a sailor's wife. And he selected this site because it was probably next to Tom Hamilton, the great football hero, but also it was across from the 2 earliest sailors buried here in the cemetery. Paul DeShiel and Tom Hamilton, both great football heroes, both coached Navy teams, but Tom also played football. And the class of 1927, he is the midshipman that's in the Commission Invisible window in the chapel, too. He was president of his class. And so his image was used for that stained glass window. But in 1927, Navy was #1 in the country. Army-Navy was invited to dedicate Soldiers Field in Chicago. And it was snowing and so forth, and Army was winning 4th quarter, and Tom Hamilton scored and tied the game. So that meant Navy didn't win. They stayed in first place. There's even a board game in football named for Tom Hamilton. We have one in the collection at the museum. Now, if you can find that stone, but over here, and the sun's against us, but over near that tree with the 5, you got it?
Yeah, it's where the cross is, and then to the 2 o'clock.
Okay, 2 o'clock to the cross, the Celtic cross out here, is the tomb of Ernest J. King. That's the one that was missing when I gave my first tour of this cemetery back years ago. And by the way, the insignia on it is incorrect. Fleet admirals only wore their rank in a circle of 5 stars, not in a straight line. This stone was carved in Hardesty's place down in Galesville, where they still make gravestones. Jennifer's got some wonderful records on the stone in the archives. Knowlton served as not only as superintendent, but also as a commandant of midshipmen. Charles Melson, another soup. One of my favorite retired admirals, Admiral Irk, who lived right across the river in one of those houses over there. He used to come through the Naval Academy every morning, come from office to office telling a neat joke, and then say, have a great day. He was. Now this is the new section up in front of us. Among the noteworthy graves, I know a lot of the folks in this section. And up in here is Captain Flagg, who died aboard the American airliner that went into the Pentagon in 9/11. One of the smaller stones up here on top of the hill is that of Vice Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who became a soup here in August of 1845. He was our first aviation soup. He also brought along the USS Block Island, I think it was, a small aircraft carrier, and started classes in, very serious classes in aviation, although we'd had some long before that. But one of the stones that any Annapolitan should recognize up here on the hill has the name Wright on it, and that is the grave of none other than St. Clair Smith Wright, the mother of historic Annapolis. She was the daughter of an admiral, graduate of the academy, and the wife of a captain out of class of 27, Joe Wright. And so it's very appropriate that she's here in our cemetery, although it's sort of looking over the other shore rather than historic Annapolis itself. The great class of 1937 donated this monument, and this is a monument to all those alums who were lost, whose bodies were never recovered. And of course that's kind of a dangerous monument to build because you know some of them are going to be found, and some of them have been found since this monument was constructed. And they also recently added the lighted flags in the background, which are really nice. Yeah. This again was opened in 1987. Actually, the biggest money donated towards it was by a fellow who was West Point class of 22, Olmsted. Also, of course, the Olmsteds underwrote those wonderful scholarships for studying languages too. And his brother graduated from the Naval Academy in the class of 22. And there's a niche here with his name on it. I've forgotten where it is, but is Sharon? Yeah. Sharon Moffett, come over here. Should know this lady. If you ever have any questions about this cemetery, this is the lady that makes all the arrangements for it and manages the place and does a wonderful job. You know, we have a lot of funerals here during the year, and Sharon works with the families. And
I'm the one that takes your parking spaces away.
In front of the chapel. We'll forgive her for that one. And I know some of the I've been over here for a number of these folks here. There's one section over here where Admiral Flucky, Gene Flucky is, and a Miller. There's one section where there are two Medal of Honor winners. Now, Gene Flucky could have been buried up top in the ground because he was a flag officer, but he chose to be buried down here in the columbarium.
Richard McCool also.
Yeah, Richard McCool is the other one, World War II Medal of Honor winner, and they're in the same section as Dean Shapiro, our predecessor, and.
Coach Lenz.
Oh, Coach Lenz, yeah. He fell out with midshipmen many mornings. The guy that hired me, Dale Mayberry, is down. He was one of the first folks in here, as were Ramsey and former superintendent, color girl.
Winnebell?
No, Ramsey. Ramsey was the color company commander, and she was Ed Waller, daughter, Kristen Waller, and they were among the first burials here. He had been the company commander, and she'd been the color honoree that year, and they had just met to finalize their wedding plans, and then were killed in a tragic automobile accident in Florida, I believe. And today the Ramsey family gives a sword to the color company commander, and the Wallers a beautiful string of pearls for the color honoree. Anybody have any questions at this time about what we've seen or about the cemetery? And I'm in the basement of the museum. I have a couple of healthy files on this place if you're interested. Also, the cemetery has a wonderful website. If you just go into the directory for the Naval Academy, the ABC directory, and go to the letter C, strike on cemetery, and go down, and you'll have a record of everybody.
It's not working right now.
No, it's not working very good right now. I went into it this afternoon.
Because the program that we were entering it into, this academy did away with, so the last 2 years have not been entered.
Oh, okay.
We're waiting for the locator kiosk that's going to go right here.
Oh,
and
okay,
it was
great.
supposed to be put in by the end of October, so I'm guessing the next month or two.
Great. But we had one summer intern named Hillary who spent the whole summer on her hands and knees, photographed every gravestone up top. And so there are pictures of those and transcriptions of what the gravestone says. So it's a great record, and very searchable, or has been anyway, and I'm sure will be again. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon, and